Our first presenter will tell us how CPG companies can protect brand value. Joining me now is Justin Jefferson, Vice President of Strategy and Insights for Keen Decision Systems. Justin, the podium is yours.
Thank you, John. I'm excited to dive into this topic. It has obviously become a very common question and kind of discussion point with our customers. So, very excited to run through this particular example and kind of framework for helping brands understand how to think and execute through these market uncertainties. So today, what we're really going to be talking about is the framework of how to navigate through these headwinds in a volatile market. We're going to be talking about how brands can use their actual marketing investment to drive the outcomes that are kind of more important for them as their brand has got varying objectives and priorities. We're all going to walk through some different wargaming scenarios to understand kind of how different choices lead to different outcomes, both in the short term, but also looking at that with the multi-year lens, because every decision you're making in the short term has long-term impacts. And so understanding what's optimal for today also requires understanding what will happen tomorrow. So very excited to dive into this topic today. Just a quick high level about Keen Decision Systems. Keen has been around for a little over 15 years now. We work with a variety of brands to help understand, forecast, optimize, and analyze the impact of marketing investments. So we help them determine what is the incremental from their marketing investments, how can they optimize those spends to get more value from those investments, and then we ultimately forecast those plans to help them understand what is a probabilistic range of revenues and profitable outcomes so that they can make the best decision for their brand. Just a quick who we work with. So you can see on the left side, we work with numerous brands, some very well-established brands like Jif, some up-and-comers like a Poppy. We really work with all different business sizes, mostly in CPG, but we do have some retail, some fintech services, et cetera. So we work across the board. We also partner with many agencies. We have a lot of great agencies that we've established relationships with who use our software to help ensure that they're optimizing and planning their marketing mix as best as possible to support their brands. So today we're going to jump into a particular case study or a story for one brand that we've been working with. We'll take a step back a few months ago, before kind of a lot of the uncertainty became more prevalent in today's market. The brand had created a plan that they felt very confident in. They knew exactly what they were going to invest, and they had modeled out what that revenue and profitability was. And they felt like they were really balancing their revenue and profitability objectives with this particular plan. So I just want to highlight two of these charts right here. On the top right, you'll see this chart and this one as well as we go throughout the presentation. But this is what we call a revenue response curve. So the x-axis is the investment, how much is the brand spending in marketing investments, and the y is the projected revenue. And so you can see the y here on the projected revenue. They're projecting right around 603 million for that 31.2 million investment. And then on the same side, we look at that not only for how much revenue you're driving, but also what's the profitability of that investment. So again, you can see they're investing right at that 31.2 million. And they're driving roughly 30.7 million in profit. And so you can see this is a curve where this is kind of that point of diminishing returns where each additional investment generates kind of fewer or less long-term profit. So they're right past that point, but they're kind of really almost at the optimal point. So they felt like this was a good blend of their objectives of wanting to make sure that they're driving a lot, some top line growth, but also maintaining that bottom line profitability in the level they wanted. And they felt very comfortable. But then April happened and things have changed. And so ultimately, we want to talk through when this adverse kind of headwinds of this kind of adverse economic situation arises. How do you navigate through that? A lot of times we hear customers wanting to just immediately throw out their plan, start over, cut back spend, take a knee-jerk reaction. So we want to help customers kind of take a step back, understand what the kind of headwinds they're facing, what that potential outcome is based off of their current plan, and then be able to kind of pivot and react in the best way appropriate. So generally, we've been talking with our brands about numerous different types of headwinds. I'm sure some of you all may be facing some of these. Things from just slowing category demand, dealing with margin pressures, pricing decisions, maybe supply chain disruptions. But ultimately, these types of headwinds really help you challenge, are you doing the right plan? But they shouldn't just outright have you replace it, right? You shouldn't be just throwing out the plan because you're about to run into, some particular headwind, because you may be over kind of reacting to the situation. So today we're going to focus on a brand that has indicated they're going to be struggling with two specific areas. One, they see a top line slowing category demand. So with less kind of discretionary income, with more switching costs, they believe that they're going to see around a 10% impact to their overall demand. And then they're going to actually also be looking at margin pressures. So on the slowing demand, obviously that's going to have a top line impact. You're going to be selling lower volumes in general if you have that kind of slowing category demand. But it also does have a bottom line impact as you think about marketing becomes less effective when your audience is less primed to purchase your product. And it's, because of that, it is harder to convert those buyers. And so your effectiveness may be impacted by this kind of slowing demand. On the margin pressure side, they're also expecting a roughly 10% impact to their margin, which all things being equal, losing a little bit on the margin shouldn't hurt the top line, but it will hurt that bottom line because amount of profit per unit is going down and each sale is essentially less valuable. So how much you can spend on marketing to drive that sale, the numbers change. And so the first thing we want to do is, okay, if we're about to run into these types of headwinds, let's model out what does that do for our business and our expected revenue and profitability, given like we saw before on those curves, how do those curves now change? So the first one we're going to start with is that revenue response curve. And so what you can see here is that the pre-tariff and post-tariff curves are obviously different. The post-tariff curve has shifted down from that 10% category demand pressure. And so ultimately, that pre-tariff was saying 31 million gets you roughly 603. Now post-tariff with these headwinds, you're really looking at closer to 544, which is roughly a 10% decrease in your overall revenue, just because of this particular headwind. And so you can see that there's a similar kind of gap across the board. You're really going to be down roughly 10% against the previous environment without these headwinds. So we can talk a little bit about how changing your investment changes your revenue, but it's really just important to understand that net you're going to see that bit of a negative pressure. You need to quantify kind of how impactful or how important are these revenue numbers. The next is looking at the profit side. And so the profit side, you actually see a similar kind of shifting down of that curve, but also you can see that the gap is growing. That kind of concaves lower because ultimately with not only the margin pressure, but the kind of less primed audience to purchase, your marketing is having to work harder. It's essentially going to be less effective. And so you're kind of being penalized not only from the lower returns per unit you're selling, but also because that your marketing just won't be as effective in an environment where your audience is less likely to purchase, or the consumers are less likely to purchase. So you can see that the pre-tariff and post-tariff have a pretty significant decrease here. And so just understanding where are they on the curve, what are the new forecasts, and then what do they want to do about it? So at an outset, this is a summary of the changes. Right? They had a pre-tariff plan that they felt very comfortable about, but now with these new headwinds, they're not changing. If they don't change the investment, they're looking at a minus 59 million in revenue and a roughly minus 12 million in profit. So obviously they're kind of getting pressured both on the top and the bottom line, but they aren't powerless. They have now the kind of option or decision. What do they want to do now? How do they react? Do they want to try and claw back top line and potentially try and drive more revenue and offset some of that loss? Do they want to look at trying to protect some more of that profit and potentially mitigate the amount of profit loss they're going to take? Or do they feel confident that they kind of have a good plan and want to keep with that? So we're going to walk through some potential different outcomes or war game kind of different options that they have and what that means both for their revenue and their profitability. So here again, we have that forecasted response curve. Again, you can see how that curve is kind of going up and to the right. Really what the message here is, if you pull back on spend in an environment of headwinds, you're going to see even greater top line impacts. And so we often hear from customers that the immediate reaction is to have their budget cut or pull back on spending, but they often don't think about what is the kind of quantifiable impact of doing so versus keeping the same plan. So here you can see on the curve with that 31, they were getting roughly 544 in revenue. However, if they pulled back roughly around 10-ish million, they're going to actually see a bigger hit to that top line, down to 529, versus if they had increased, their spend in this type of environment, they're going to go up another 10, maybe 11, and then they're going to see roughly a similar 10, 11 million increase in their revenue. So pulling back on this investment will deepen the losses. Investing more can help recover those losses. Now, it's important to recognize that they were previously above 600 million, and the farther you go out in the curve, you're really not going to get back to that 600 million number here, even if they did increase. So, trying to recover all of that revenue is probably not the best move. Again, depends on the particular brand and the situation they're in and their priorities. But it's really a question of like, how much can I make a change that'll help, on the margins, that'll help improve my top line a little bit or my bottom line a little bit. And here, what we can demonstrate is changing your investment profile changes your top line impact. But changing your investment profile also changes your bottom line impact and the kind of profitability. So here we have that same profitability curve, and you could see where those three investment selections kind of net out. So if you had invested less and you pulled back about 10 million, you see that you're working up the curve, and so you're getting more profit. You're kind of getting to that peak point of profit, just shy of, roughly around 21, just shy of that 21 million. And then if you keep that same plan, you're at 19. If you do try to invest more to kind of offset some of that revenue loss, great, you can do that, but you will be sacrificing a little bit on your profit. So as the investment scales, that profit does erode because you're kind of working your way down the curve. Where this 0 point, meaning kind of roughly around that 71, 74 million, is where they actually end up getting no profit left, where they've kind of, essentially come out net zero on that. So for them, it's important that they make sure that they're still maintaining a strong profit. Again, each individual brand we work with, they may be at a different point on this curve. So not all numbers are going to be exactly the same for every brand. It's really based off of where you are. But it's this framework that we encourage our customers to think about. What is the right way I can adjust my plan to prioritize the kind of outcomes that are most important for me, whether that's top line or bottom line? And here again, it's just a quick high-level summary of what we're seeing. Again, if you reduce spend, you're going to save on some of that investment, but you're going to be taking a hit on your revenue. Yes, you'll protect profit, but is that worth the 15 million loss in revenue? On the other side, if you increase spend relative to maintaining it, you're going to put about 10, roughly more into your spend. You're going to get an incremental, top line impact, but you're also going to take a hit on the bottom line. So you're really having to deal with this trade-off. What is more important for your business? Again, you can keep that maintain spend, that original plan, because it is still a fairly optimal plan. Curves have shifted down, so you're going to get less out of it, but it's still a really well-constructed plan. So again, we don't always encourage people to, throw the baby out with the bathwater, to, try to start over from scratch when they face a headwind. It's really important to start from what are you currently doing and how does that particular outcome change given this headwind? And then what do you want to do about that? How do you shift or adjust? And so not only can you make an adjustment that impacts you in year one and kind of model out what those impacts are, it's also important that you think about your decisions today and what that might cost you tomorrow. Trade-offs aren't just short-term. They actually compound over time. And so it's important to think about these decisions with a longer-term frame. There's really a couple important parts of being able to increase your spend versus decreasing your spend. If you can increase your spend and keep that top line revenue higher up, you're essentially able to kind of maintain higher velocity than what you previously would. You're able to probably gain some more of that market share, and you're able to benefit from some of the long-term impacts of that marketing investment. If you pull back, it's on the opposite side. You're going to lose market share, you're going to slow down your velocity, and you're likely, going to be struggling with next year because you don't have the tailwinds of your marketing investments from the previous year. And so when we talk about the tailwinds of marketing investment, I think it's important to kind of conceptualize what we're really discussing here. In Keen's system, we truly believe that marketing is an investment into the brand. It's a way to, not just spend as a cost line item, but as a true investment to grow your brand. And we kind of contextualize those investments in different ways. And we think a little bit around this concept of, you have tactics that are short-term transaction drivers. Think about your trade, your coupon, maybe your search. And you have some long-term equity building tactics. Think about your television, your streaming video, your social, your out of home. Each of those different types of investments have different types of impacts in the market. Your trade, your coupons, those are going to get you some immediate sales. You're going to see most of that impact from that investment kind of be actualized in the first 8 weeks. And that tail kind of diminishes. So you don't really get a lot of long-term effect from that level of investment. However, on the long-term equity building side, when you are investing in the social, the streaming video, the television, you're getting about 30-ish% of that benefit in the first 8 weeks, and the rest of it over the duration of the next year or two. And so you're really getting a bit of a long-term tail and benefit from those investments. And obviously, these percentages are just kind of rough estimates, kind of on average. When we model, we typically see these shifts based off the type of brand, the type of marketing they're doing. So these are just kind of rough rules of thumb, not necessarily a hard and fast for everyone. But if you think about conceptually these two frames, you realize that the long-term investments can have value moving into year two. And your ability of what you invest in year one can actually shape how well you perform in year two. And so we really want to help customers understand not only how does that decision they want to make impact this year's forecast, but also how does it influence next year's forecast? Because that's just as important, is setting yourself up for success next year. So when we take a kind of a war game with a multi-year lens, we can actually look at, well, what happens in year two if I did different year ones? And so that's exactly what we've simulated here. So the question is really, how does year two change based off of year one's decision? So imagine that in year one, you face these headwinds. You either have the choice of reducing spend, maintaining spend, or increasing spend. But in year two, you're back to normal and you keep that same maintained spend planned. So in year two, we're essentially holding all else equal. And we're trying to understand what is the year two outcome differences based off of year one's plan, year one's decision. And so again, what you can see here is that in year two, if you actually reduce your spend in year one, you're going to see less revenue and less profit because you just have less of those tailwinds. You lost your share, you lost some velocity, you don't have as much of the long-term benefits and kind of equity building activations that you had if you had maintained your spend. And then the opposite side, if you had actually increased your spend, you would actually be essentially setting yourself up for a better year two, where you were seeing higher revenues and higher profits because you do come into year two with stronger tailwinds that you're building on top of. So if you use this, you can kind of understand the frame of, what are the short-term trade-offs versus what are the long-term trade-offs. And it's important to really evaluate both because those decisions in year one will impact the opportunity in year two. And again, these numbers aren't universal. They will change based off of where you are on the curve, how effective you are with your marketing dollars, kind of how much you're looking to pull back or increase your spend, how competitive your environment is. There are many things that can change exactly the rate of change or the percentage change here. But ultimately, what we really want to conceptualize is that the answer usually is not just cut spend or just go dark, because that's really going to set yourself up for a lot more headwinds in the future, even when you kind of overcome the category slowdown and the margin pressures. And so really taking a look at it, not just year one and year two, but also holistically. You combine year one and year two combined. You say, okay, what does the combined investments, revenue, and profit of year one and year two look like if I do a different year one activity? And again, similar concept, you're going to see, reduced investment on that reduced spend plan, but you're going to see reduced revenue and reduced profit. On the increased spend, you're obviously going to be spending more in your marketing investments, but you're going to be generating more in the revenue, and you'll be losing a little bit on the profit because, again, for this particular client, they were past that point of diminishing returns slightly. And so if they wanted to invest more, they're going to be sacrificing some profit. If they're on the left side of that curve, there's obviously some opportunity to improve that profit. But Typically, when most brands are planning, they're trying to find that optimal point, and that's kind of what we like to frame this conversation around. Is if you start from an optimal plan, when you face headwinds, the answer isn't always to change. Sometimes the optimal plan is the right action. Sometimes you might want to increase that spend to offset some of the revenue losses because that's a bigger priority. Sometimes you might want to focus on the profit because that's a bigger priority. But over the long term, cutting that spend can actually be hurtful for you on the profit. And so what we really wanted to demonstrate here, and what we work with all of our customers to help understand, is cutting spend can slow revenue growth across both years, not just year one, but also year two. And strategic reinvestment can actually boost revenue with marginal profit impact. Now, again, some brands may see a larger profit impact versus others, but it's really important just to frame this concept around what are the trade-offs that you're willing to entertain and deal with when you face this type of adversity. So that's exactly what we do here with our clients. Keen ultimately has a software that empowers customers to make that right decision. We do various war game kind of scenarios is what we call them, or modeling of, how do I plan around different external business factors, right? How positive tailwinds or negative headwinds. How do we hit certain revenue goals? What does it look like if I add new channels? How do I maximize my multi-year profitability and the amount of investment? Or, hey, if I just have a specific budget, how do I best optimize that budget? And so what we try to do is help customers conceptualize the different, trade-offs of each of these potential decisions, and help them really realize what is in the best interest of their brand and, the objectives that they want to meet. So I will also go ahead and flash the Keen Insights report, a recent report that we released that has robust data across 350 brands, more than $1 billion in the last year. I think in general the report has more than 10 billion of investment, and we really dive into all kind of trends that we're seeing. Right, what is the amount of investment that brands reinvest into marketing, looking at based off of different business sizes, how much are they reinvesting revenue into that brand. We look at what the expected profits are. We look at the allocation across different types of media tactics at top of funnel versus bottom of funnel. So it's a very rich report that gives a lot of great insights on kind of what we see with different brands of different sizes and kind of how the evolution of their marketing execution has changed over the last few years. So I would really encourage anyone to kind of jump into that if they're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the trends that we see in the market. And I encourage you to check that out and follow up with any questions if you have that.
Okay, Justin, we've got some questions, Justin, that came in that for you. Number one, what kind of questions are the best marketing leaders asking right now that others aren't thinking about yet?
Yeah, that's a great question, and ultimately, I would approach that in a couple different ways. First, what they're looking at is the long-term financial impact of their marketing investments. A lot of brands that we talk with, or prospects that we're kind of bringing into the fold, they're focusing on what's my 1 year ROAS, iROAS, different kind of CPA metrics, et cetera. And we wholly encourage using key performance indicators to optimize your marketing investments. But what we really encourage customers to do is think about the financial impact when you take into account not only the margin of your products, but also the long-term profitability of your marketing. Where are you netting out, and how is your business either growing or falling over the years? So really taking that multi-year financial impact. Two, the other thing that we're seeing a lot of our kind of best brands really asking about is how can we model best base and worst case outcomes. So we'll look at what are potential headwinds, whether that's through distribution, category slowing, pricing changes, and we model out, okay, in a best case scenario, what does this look like? In a worst case scenario, what does this look like? In a base scenario, what does this look like? Providing those range of outcomes kind of better equips the team to understand what should we expect, and then how do we understand as we get closer through that time period, which path are we on, right? Are we really actually moving towards more of that worst case because the headwinds are kind of growing in a more kind of significant way than we thought, or is it actually more of a base case? And so really making sure that you're forecasting your future revenues based off of not only your marketing investments, but the factors that are influencing your business is very critical, especially in such a volatile market.
Okay. Another question that came up. What qualities do you see in the brand teams that are most successful at navigating tough budget conversations?
Yeah, tough budget conversations are they're tough. People don't really enjoy having these conversations of, hey, I might get my budget cut. How do I react to this? But every brand I've worked with has kind of gone through that phase, whether it's a budget cut or a budget increase. Your budget's going to change, and so being able to kind of have the right framework through that conversation is critical. So a great way of kind of contextualizing that is by modeling out, well, if I have a static budget, what will I drive? If I have a budget cut, what would that mean for me, both for the top line and bottom line? And really helping to quantify that can provide the brand managers with the appropriate information to go back to their leadership and potentially advocate for more budget or demonstrate the kind of effects of what would a cut budget look like. So first off is really just making sure that you're modeling what these outcomes are so that you can bring that insight to the leadership and to whoever's making the budget cut decisions of, hey, if we do this, this will be the likely outcomes. If we don't, this will be our likely outcomes. And really being able to contextualize those decisions. The second is working closely with your media teams and your kind of partners to help assess the right plan, not only from the level of investment, but the mix of investment. And so we talked about short-term transaction driving, long-term equity building, really figuring out what is the kind of need for the brand. If it is more revenue, could you reallocate to short-term transaction driving? How does that look with your media team? Do they have opportunities to really purchase more inventory at the bottom of the funnel and do so effectively? Or should they be looking at more top of the funnel to try and keep that brand equity over time? Really, it's going to be up to you. But ultimately, I'd say one is modeling to understand the potential outcomes of these budget decisions. And then two, if you do have to go through them, partnering with the appropriate resources to make sure that you have kind of the best in line plan to support that.
Okay, another question. Uh, how often do brand teams actually stick to an optimized plan? What tends to throw them off course?
Man, I wish it was 100%, but it is very rarely 100%. When it comes to actuality, putting dollars in the market and buying certain inventories at certain levels over, a year can be more difficult than it might look like when it's just on a spreadsheet or, just on a flow chart. So when we work with our customers, we help them understand what are the levers in which they can be pulling more investment, higher flighting, lower flighting, more continuity. We talk through the methodologies and the kind of practices that they should be approaching with their marketing investments. And then we ultimately provide a week by week investment by tactic plan. But very rarely will our brands execute exactly on that week by week and tactic by tactic plan, because ultimately there are some kind of limitations and also benefits of purchasing media in certain ways that need to still be flexible for. So what we encourage our customers to do is, not let perfect be the enemy of better, right? You have, what you did last year, which was good, and you see an opportunity to get much better. The perfect plan doesn't mean that if you don't do that, you just can't be better, right? You find what is part of that perfect plan and how can you take steps towards that direction. And a lot of times we're really talking about the level of flighting, right? Are you over investing in certain weeks or under investing in certain weeks? We see customers under investing in the off season, over investing in the on season. And so we help them try to right size their budgets by season, but ultimately, there are some kind of executional benefits and, kind of challenges that they run into. So they won't always end up the same. But our goal is to make sure that your net profitability and revenue is growing year over year and in a way that kind of aligns with your objectives. And so we encourage a certain plan that can help you find kind of what the most optimal is, but ultimately brands are usually taking kind of bites at that apple and taking step-by-step approaches of becoming better. And very rarely does a customer just go 100% to a fully optimized plan.
Okay, next question that came in. When you're modeling future scenarios, how do you help brands avoid, rather, how do you help brands avoid overconfidence in a single outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question, because at the end of the day, the last thing anyone really wants to do is take a specific revenue number to their leadership, to the bank, and say this is exactly what it's going to be, and if it's not that, then they look bad. And so within our application, and various approaches that you take to modeling and forecasting futures, we always expect some range of probabilistic outcomes. So our model leverages a probabilistic approach where it actually can provide you a range of uncertainties around your revenue. And so within our application, we have kind of what we would call a bit of a curve that helps you understand, you know, at what probability you're going to hit certain revenues. And so there's points on that curve where it's an 80% chance greater than X amount of revenue, or an 80% chance lower than X amount of revenue. But really just taking this concept of a range of potential outcomes is really the most important concept. And we can do that either by modeling out best case, worst case, base case to understand a potential range of future revenues based off of what happens environmentally, or you could really just take in a base case situation probabilistically, the most probable will be that 50-50 point, this, given revenue target, but there's still a probability that it's below that and it's above that and it's within a certain range. So trying to find the right area on the curve that you can be comfortable with, so that you can feel confident in the kind of forecasted numbers that you're providing, but not feel like you have one exact point estimate, exact number that you're going to hit, because it rarely ever works out like that.
Okay. Well, here's the last question we have, and actually, it's my favorite. Are there any common mental traps about marketing spend that still show up even when the data tells a different story?
Oh, that is a good question. That is a good question. So mental traps regarding the marketing investments. I think for what we see, there are a few core principles that we commonly see that help brands make more value out of their marketing investments. One is the concept of continuity. Being able to have a more always on approach is actually much more successful than going heavy up and then going dark. And so sometimes what we often hear is that, well, I can purchase, these GRPs or these impressions at a cheaper rate if I buy this very heavy up campaign where I go very aggressive over this 4 to 6 week period than I could if I went on the evergreen approach. And really what we're talking about there is the effectiveness and the efficiency, and really just kind of making sure that you don't catch yourself in the mental trap of optimizing for efficiency and ignoring the impact of effectiveness. Because that first dollar you advertise after being dark for 6 weeks will not go as far as that dollar you advertise after being on for 6 weeks consistently. So really making sure that you're thinking about not just what you can buy that inventory or that marketing for, but also what will that deliver, and how do you create a comprehensive plan. And another common concept we see is the bottom and top of funnel, or kind of the exposure to transaction driving versus equity building. Very small brands tend to overemphasize on the bottom of funnel because it's the easiest to attribute. It's the easiest to track and to say, hey, here's what my marketing delivered. The top of funnel is much harder to quantify. And when you're a smaller brand, you have less budget, you really want to feel good about what it's delivering, and so you're likely to try and gravitate to where you can make sure you're confident in that delivery. But what we often see is that brands are overspending on the bottom of funnel, and that if they actually reallocated or added dollars to the top of funnel, their bottom would become more effective. So essentially, by driving more awareness and getting more exposure into the market, you're going to eventually get more demand, which you can capture with your bottom of funnel tactics more effectively. If not, you're really going to over emphasize that bottom of funnel and do so at diminishing returns. Even though you can attribute it cleanly, you're really not going to be getting the best bang for your buck.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Justin. If anyone in the audience has further questions or want to follow up more about some of the points that Justin made, his email is on the screen, justin.jefferson@keends.com. So thank you, Justin. I really appreciate it. That was really great.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with the audience.
Okay, take care.
Bye.